My friends, I want to begin this by saying something very important because what I am about to share is not theory, not imagination, and not something I learned from a book. This comes from years of direct involvement in witchcraft, spiritual manipulation, and hidden practices that most families never realize they are connected to. When you look at old family photos, you see memories, faces, smiles, and moments frozen in time. But what I saw while I was still deep in darkness was something very different. I saw spiritual anchors, emotional gateways, and energetic containers holding pain, vows, trauma, and agreements that were never healed. And tonight, I'm finally telling the truth about what is really attached to many of those pictures hanging quietly in your home. When I was still practicing, one of the first things I was taught was that objects remember, not in a poetic way, but in a spiritual way. Photos, especially old ones, are not just images, they are imprints. They capture more than light. They capture emotional intensity, spiritual atmosphere, and unspoken moments. Family photos taken during seasons of grief, abuse, jealousy, sickness, or generational conflict carry those emotions forward. In the dark realm, we were trained to use photos as points of access because they hold identity, lineage, and bloodline memory. Every face in a photograph represents a legal connection, and every connection can be touched if the door is already open. What shocked me most was learning how often families unknowingly preserve pain out of loyalty. Old photos of relatives who lived in bitterness, control, addiction, or secret sin are kept to honor them. But no one asks what spirit governed their lives. In witchcraft, we were taught to read family patterns through images. We could see repeated expressions, repeated body language, repeated emotional weight. Those repetitions are not accidents. They reveal spiritual cycles passed down quietly. When those photos remain displayed without prayer or discernment, they act like silent witnesses that keep old agreements alive, reinforcing the same struggles in future generations. There were times I was instructed to work specifically through family albums, not because the paper had power on its own, but because the memories attached to them were still alive in the hearts of the living. Grief that was never surrendered, trauma that was normalized, and fear that was inherited all strengthen the energetic imprint of a photo. The darker the emotional history, the stronger the attachment. That's why some people feel heavy, sad, or unsettled when looking at certain old pictures and never understand why. Your spirit recognizes what your mind has learned to ignore. Let me say this clearly because I don't want confusion. Not every old photo is evil, and not every memory is dangerous. But unhealed history becomes a spiritual foothold. In witchcraft, we never needed to create new pain when old pain was already preserved. Family photos taken during funerals, forced marriages, sickness, or times of oppression were considered especially powerful. They marked moments where identity was fractured. And when identity fractures, something always tries to fill the gap. That is how generational oppression sustains itself quietly, without loud rituals or obvious signs. I remember standing in rooms filled with candles and whispered words, holding nothing more than a photograph. No hair, no blood, no object stolen from a home, just a picture. And yet the atmosphere would shift instantly. Why? Because photos lock moments into permanence. They keep emotions from moving forward. When families revisit the same painful memories again and again, they unknowingly keep reopening doors that were meant to close. Darkness feeds on stagnation. Healing requires movement, truth, and light, but photos can freeze people in versions of themselves that God never intended them to remain. Another thing I was taught is that family photos reinforce identity statements. When a child grows up seeing images tied to loss, failure, or shame, those images speak without words. They say, "This is who we are," or "This is what always happens to us." In witchcraft, we exploited that belief system. We didn't need to curse people who already believed they were cursed. Old photos became mirrors reflecting limitation instead of destiny. And the longer those mirrors stayed unchallenged, the deeper the pattern rooted itself into the bloodline. There were houses I entered that felt heavy before a single word was spoken. Often, the walls were covered with old portraits, watching silently. Some families complained of constant conflict, depression, or repeated tragedy, but they never questioned what spiritual atmosphere they were maintaining. In the dark realm, we understood something most people don't. Environments preach sermons. What you display, honor, and revisit repeatedly shapes what has permission to remain. Photos connected to unresolved pain quietly preach survival, not freedom. One of the hardest truths for me to accept after leaving witchcraft was realizing how often love and bondage coexist. People keep old photos because they loved those relatives. But love does not mean agreement. Honoring someone does not mean carrying what wounded them. In darkness, we used that confusion effectively. We knew people would defend objects tied to family history, even when those objects were keeping cycles alive. That's why discernment is so important. Light does not erase memory, but it redeems it, and redemption often requires letting go. If you've ever felt emotionally drained, anxious, or uneasy in certain rooms of your house, especially where old photos are displayed, that is not random. Your spirit senses unresolved weight. In witchcraft, we called it emotional residue. But in truth, it's unhealed spiritual matter. Darkness does not create most problems. It simply takes advantage of what was never brought into the light. Family photos connected to trauma become storage units for that unresolved matter. quietly influencing moods, dreams, and even decisions. I'm sharing this not to bring fear, but to bring understanding. Fear keeps people stuck, but truth sets people free. When I finally encountered Jesus, I learned that light doesn't argue with darkness, it exposes it. Old family photos only have power when pain remains unhealed and agreements remain unbroken. The moment truth enters, the grip weakens. In the next part, I will explain how these attachments form spiritually, how they affect generations, and how freedom actually begins without rituals, fear, or destruction. What most people never realize is that spiritual attachment does not always look dramatic or violent. Sometimes it looks like familiarity. Old family photos become trusted companions, quietly present through every season of life. But in the dark realm, familiarity is one of the strongest hiding places. Attachments form when emotion, identity, and memory stay bonded without healing. If a photograph represents a moment where fear, loss, humiliation, or betrayal was sealed instead of surrendered, that moment remains spiritually active. It doesn't fade with time, it waits. That is why patterns repeat years later in children who never lived those moments but somehow carry the same emotional weight. In witchcraft, we understood generational flow very clearly. Spirits do not need permission from every generation. They only need one open door that remains unaddressed. Old photos act like proof of continuity. They say, this line still remembers, still honors, still holds. When trauma is remembered without truth, it becomes a landing place. I saw families struggle with the same illnesses, the same relationship breakdowns, the same financial collapses, all while cherishing images connected to the very seasons where those cycles began. It was never coincidence. Darkness studies patterns patiently, while people often dismiss them as bad luck. Dreams are one of the first places these attachments manifest. Many people dream of deceased relatives repeatedly, not always in comforting ways. Sometimes the dreams feel heavy, confusing, or emotionally draining. In witchcraft, dreams connected to photos were considered indicators of active memory portals. The spirit revisits what the soul keeps open. When a photograph anchors unresolved grief, the soul keeps returning to that space at night, searching for closure that never came. Without light, those dreams never resolve, they simply repeat, reinforcing emotional bondage. Another subtle effect is identity confusion. People raised around certain family images often unconsciously inherit emotional expressions. The same sadness in the eyes, the same posture of defeat, the same emotional reactions to stress. In darkness, we call this image inheritance. The photo becomes a silent teacher. It doesn't speak words, but it models a way of being. Over time, people start living out expressions that were never theirs to carry. Freedom feels unfamiliar because bondage has been normalized through memory. I want to say something gently but honestly. Healing does not come from destroying photos in fear. Fear is still agreement with darkness. True freedom begins when truth enters the story connected to the image. When pain is acknowledged, surrendered, and placed under the authority of Jesus, the attachment loses its legal ground. Darkness thrives where pain is protected. Light enters when pain is exposed without shame. This is why some people feel sudden relief simply by praying over family history, even before removing or storing certain items. When I left witchcraft, I was surprised by how simple light really is. There were no complex rituals. There was repentance, forgiveness, and truth spoken aloud. I watched emotional heaviness lift from rooms once prayers were prayed with understanding. Old photos stopped feeling oppressive because the memories connected to them were no longer hiding. Healing rewrites spiritual memory. It does not erase the past, but it breaks its authority over the present. Darkness loses interest when it can no longer manipulate unresolved emotion. Some people ask why certain photos feel neutral, while others feel heavy. The answer is emotional truth. Photos connected to joy, safety, and genuine love carry peace, because there is no fracture to exploit. But images tied to survival, fear, control, or silent suffering carry unresolved tension. In witchcraft, we always sought tension. Peace offered us nothing. That's why healing is the greatest act of spiritual warfare. A healed memory becomes useless to darkness. There is also a difference between remembrance and dwelling. Remembrance honors lessons. Dwelling keeps wounds open. When families repeatedly revisit stories of loss without redemption, they unknowingly rehearse trauma. Photos become visual scripts that reinforce the same emotional outcomes. In light, stories are retold with truth, hope, and closure. That shift alone dismantles many attachments. Darkness cannot survive where hope is spoken consistently. I want you to understand that freedom does not require perfection. It requires willingness. Willingness to ask, what emotions are tied to this image? Willingness to release what was never meant to be carried forward. When Jesus enters memory, he restores identity. He separates who you are from what happened. That separation is devastating to darkness because it removes the lie that pain defines destiny. If you sense heaviness connected to old family photos, don't panic. Awareness is already light entering the room. Pray with intention. Speak forgiveness where bitterness lived. Invite Jesus into those moments that were never healed. You may feel peace replace tension almost immediately. That is not imagination. That is authority shifting. Darkness retreats when it loses agreement. I'm sharing this because many people are fighting battles they never started, carrying emotions they never chose, and reliving stories that were never theirs to finish. Old family photos don't control you, but unhealed history tries to influence you. The moment truth is spoken, that influence breaks. Freedom is not loud. It is gentle, steady, and lasting. And once it begins, generations after you will feel the difference.